It is hard to imagine a more romantic era in American history than that of the American frontier in the 18th and 19th centuries. The depiction of this period in various films, novels, paintings, and even songs evokes images of bold explorers, blazing trails in the West, fearlessly treading deep into unknown Indian territories. The romanticization of this period evokes images of families in cozy wagons happily following the paths charted by the pioneers to reach the West, where milk and honey flow from the land. Furthermore, this era was the period of the famous California gold rush, when anyone armed with only a shovel could strike gold like Midas and amass a vast fortune overnight. And of course, how can we forget the beautiful romantic cowboys on horseback with their distinctive cowboy hats? Many of us have surely had moments when we wished we were like those pioneers too. After all, their lives were simple, fulfilling, and free from the stresses of career advancement and the complex dynamics of our relentlessly fast-paced digital age. This idealized version of life on the American frontier, however, couldn't be further from reality. Life on the frontier has been extremely difficult, lonely, dangerous, and neglected. So it's time to shatter misconceptions and explore some hidden truths about this most popularized era in American history. In this video, we'll explore some of the dirtiest secrets in American history related to life on the American frontier during the peak of westward migration, which was from the early 19th to the 20th century. In the West, during the frontier era, anyone claiming a piece of land legally had only 5 years to prove themselves and build a house on it. Most settlers, however, did not have the necessary means to build a house. Therefore, many of them ended up losing their land claims before the 5 years were up. In addition, in many areas, trees were almost non-existent, and houses were built of adobe rather than wood. Brick houses were devoid of light, constantly infested by bugs and vermin, and prone to leaks and caving in when it rained. In areas where there were trees, log houses were preferred. However, they were not nearly as cozy. The construction of the houses was physically exhausting. The men had to cut down the trees with only an axe and gather several tons of stones for the foundation and fireplace. The logs weighed up to 500 pounds, and many of the men had no helpers to lift them. Finished cabins were usually one room, measuring 3 by 6 meters with a sleeping loft, and were 2 to 3 meters high, depending on whether the builders had help during construction to lift the logs higher. Their floors were made of earth, and putting glass in the windows took years. The small space meant that all the children had to share one bed in the loft, while their parents shared another just below them. Most beds were stacked boards or straws with a blanket thrown over them. The furniture was primitive and uncomfortable. Pioneer families consisted of up to 10 children, and all aspects of indoor life occurred in this one room, meaning that privacy and personal space were nothing but a figment of the imagination. The cruel winters. Another myth about the border huts is that they were warm and cozy in winter. In reality, however, the walls of the huts had little or no insulation and provided only wind protection. It was therefore as cold inside as it was outside. The fire did little to warm the room because the warm air went outside. Keeping the fire going was crucial, as it was the only source of heat, albeit insufficient. To keep the fire going all winter, the family needed a supply of wood as large as the hut itself. On the prairies, where wood was scarce and valuable, settlers resorted to using dried buffalo dung as fuel, called buffalo sawdust. However, fires were no more than a small consolation against the bitter winter cold. Horrible deaths and diseases. Being crushed by a cartwheel, a failed swing with an axe, being attacked by a wild animal while hunting before you can complete the lengthy process of reloading your weapon. Such accidents were common, due to the dangerous nature of life in frontier areas. In addition, the close surroundings in which frontier families lived meant that when one person contracted an infectious disease, the rest of the family would almost certainly become infected as well. It was not uncommon for several children in one family to die from one infectious disease. In wagon settlements, hundreds of people used a single water source, which led to high rates of diseases caused by contagion, such as cholera and dysentery. Dysentery is not a harmless disease at all. It causes diarrhea so severe that it can lead to death from dehydration in just a few hours. Tragically, when the disease affects such a settlement, the dead are buried in shallow graves. Wolves dug up the bodies, and families could no longer visit the graves of their loved ones. Reuniting with loved ones has been extremely difficult. When a settler family decides to leave their home, they are aware that they will probably never see their family and friends again. First-hand accounts of settlers, especially women, lament the difficulties of leaving and being separated from their kin. Caring for the land required daily work, and traveling by wagon took too long, so there was no opportunity for a vacation to visit family and relatives. Although homesteaders could send mail home, travel was so slow that it took up to 6 months or even longer to receive a letter from family and friends in other areas of the United States. Loneliness and depression. Women living on the frontier were particularly prone to isolation as their work was concentrated in the home and took up the whole day. Women from border areas stayed at home all day, waiting for their husbands to return from the fields or industries where they worked. In the 19th century, mental health issues were not yet fully understood, such as depression, severe anxiety, bipolar disorders, etc. However, based on numerous first-person accounts and letters, the majority of settler women would undoubtedly have been diagnosed with depression and other related mental health problems in today's world. The whole day was filled with obligations. It is not at all surprising that the pioneers developed depression and other related mental problems, given the fact that their entire day, from sunrise to sunset, was spent working. Providing for their usually large families took up most of the day. The land in the Midwest is notoriously difficult to grow crops on and requires constant work to ensure their survival. Men spent most of their day hunting and tending the farm, while women gathered plants, prepared and preserved food, and did other household chores. To survive the winter, it was necessary to store enough food. Fruit was canned, a process that took hours. Meat had to be salted or pickled in brine, which meant it had to be thoroughly cleaned before consumption, or smoked, which required keeping a fire going for weeks. Caring for the fire took up much of the settler women's days, as maintaining a high enough temperature required constant regulation. Other duties women were expected to perform included sewing, cleaning, and caring for livestock. Frontier settler women did not have sewing machines, so clothing had to be sewn and repaired by hand. Laundry had to be done with a tub and washboard, and there were no conveniences such as vacuum cleaners or running water to facilitate cleaning. Milking the cows, cleaning the pen, and feeding the animals could take hours and was usually a chore. There were no breaks or vacations or even a little time off. Days passed in a never-ending work, knowing that tomorrow would bring only new chores, and the cycle went on forever. Hunger was ubiquitous. Settlers traded their crops to earn money to spend in what was called the general store to buy staples like flour and sometimes luxuries like coffee and white sugar. It was not uncommon for general stores to reduce inventory by filling much of their space with plaster or sawdust to save money. However, many settlers lived so far from town that trading trips were twice a year, and crop shortages could mean there was little left to trade. Luxury goods were rare, and it was difficult to afford cloth, farming tools, flour, and other necessities. Crop shortages were usually due to factors beyond the settlers' control. Droughts and locust swarms could devastate much of the crops, such as in 1874, when a swarm of 12 trillion locusts swept across the prairies, so dense that it obscured even the sky. They devoured entire fields of crops in a matter of hours, leaving farmers without food to eat and sell. No amount of hard work could compensate for these factors. The consequences simply had to be borne. The water deficit. Unless you've managed to get a riverside plot early enough, securing water will be difficult. Initially, most settlers preferred to dig wells next to their homes. However, if the well got any water at all, the runoff from the outhouse and barn would get into the water table and contaminate the water. This meant that it had to be boiled before it could be used, a tedious process given the difficulty of keeping a fire going. This water was supplemented with rainwater. However, the containers in which it was stored attracted mosquitoes and dirt, which had to be removed before use. Most families had to resort to daily trips to water sources to collect fresh water, which added extra hours to daily chores. Because of all this, few homes had enough water, and hygiene was left in the background to conserve. Entire families bathed in the same water once a week, and it was reused for laundry. Dishes were licked instead of washed. It's easy to take clean and available water for granted, but it was a luxury the settlers didn't have. The waste situation was disgusting. By the time sewers were built in Eastern American cities and wealthy families had indoor plumbing, farming families had nothing better than backyard outhouses. Some of them didn't even bother to build outbuildings but used bushes or uncovered holes. Besides, to live on a family basis, it was necessary to raise a variety of animals, and there was little that could be done with the manure except to pile it up. Many families also kept piles of buffalo sawdust near their homes to prepare for winter. In the summer, this waste gave off a horrible smell. They also attracted flies and mosquitoes, and since few settlers could afford window screens, the presence of these pests in the home was simply a fact of life. Often the flies were so numerous that one of the children had to chase the insects from the table while the others ate. The commonplace for violence and crime. The west part of the United States of America, into which all settlers flow from the east in search of a better life, land, gold, and adventure during the frontier era, is not called the Wild West for nothing. The region was extremely wild and violent. It was a place where everything was allowed. Do not misunderstand us. The United States government has tried to maintain law and order in the newly annexed United States. But the area was so vast that the few available police, sheriffs, soldiers, and other competent authorities simply could not effectively maintain law and order in the region. Therefore, the crime rate was high. Armed gangs that shoot without missing their targets rampage through the vast region, looting, maiming, and killing. In addition, there were savage and brutal attacks by the Indians, who, as expected, did not always welcome settlers entering their lands. These hidden Indian raiders, armed with poisoned arrows, usually attacked the newcomers at night, killing, raping, and kidnapping women and children. Some of the Indians' torture tactics included slow roasting or boiling the unfortunate victims alive, which is unthinkable to imagine, let alone experience. Violence and crime were so commonplace on the frontier that authorities put huge bounties on the heads of known criminals or bandits. These bounties drove bounty hunters to kill them on the spot or capture them. Yes, at that time in California, gold could be found with just a shovel and a stroke of luck. But it was also possible to lose all your gold and wealth, and even your precious life to criminal gangs in just a moment. In short, there were 1,000 ways to die in the West, on the frontier, just like in the perfectly titled film of the same phrase that explores some of those cruel death options in the old Wild West. We bet that after this breathtaking video, you're now beyond any doubt that life on the American frontier wasn't as glamorous as most movies, novels, songs, and fairy tales portray it. So the next time you watch one of those movies extolling life on the frontier, or read such novels, think again before you wish you belonged to that glorious era. If you liked this video, feel free to like, share, and subscribe to our channel. For more interesting adventures, watch our playlists or just play the next episode that comes up as a suggestion on the left.